President Donald Trump issued an order that sent shockwaves across the Western Hemisphere. Venezuelan airspace, closed to American commercial flights for 7 years, would reopen by the end of the day. American Airlines immediately announced it would resume direct flights from Miami to Caracas starting March 1st, a seemingly routine aviation decision, except it came just 27 days after U.S. Special Forces stormed the Venezuelan capital, seized the country's president, and flew him to New York City in handcuffs. This wasn't about reconnecting families or boosting tourism. This was a victory lap, and it signals something far more consequential: the return of American hemispheric dominance on a scale not seen since the Cold War. Let me explain exactly what's happening and why Latin America will never be the same. The airspace reopening didn't happen in isolation. Just 1 day earlier, on January 29th, Trump declared a national emergency regarding Cuba and authorized sweeping tariffs against any country that sells or provides oil to the island. Any country. The message was clear. If you supply Cuba with energy, you will pay an economic price for defying Washington. This came after Trump had already cut off Venezuela's oil shipments to Cuba following the capture of Nicolás Maduro on January 3rd during Operation Absolute Resolve. With Venezuela's oil gone, Cuba turned to Mexico for supplies. Trump's response? An executive order threatening tariffs on all Mexican goods if oil continued flowing to Havana. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum warned this could trigger a humanitarian crisis on the island. Where Trump's reply was chilling: Cuba will be free again. We'll be kind. What we're witnessing is the resurrection of the Monroe Doctrine, but on steroids. The original 1823 doctrine warned European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Trump's version goes further. It's not just about keeping outside powers out. It's about actively reshaping Latin America through military force, economic coercion, and regime change operations to eliminate governments Washington doesn't like. The Venezuela operation was the opening salvo. On January 3, 2026, at 2 a.m. local time, U.S. bombers and drones struck air defense systems, military bases, and infrastructure across Caracas. Over 200 special operations forces descended on Fort Tiuna, where Maduro was sleeping. Within hours, he and his wife were on a helicopter to Guantanamo Bay, then a jet to New York. The operation killed 42 Venezuelan soldiers, 32 Cuban security personnel protecting Maduro, and 2 civilians. Not a single American died. It was the first time the U.S. military bombed a South American capital and extracted a sitting head of state since the invasion of Panama in 1989 to capture Manuel Noriega. Except this time, it was faster, cleaner, and more surgical. The message to every other Latin American leader was unmistakable. If you cross Washington, you could be next. Acting President Delcy Rodriguez, who assumed power after Maduro's capture, quickly fell in line. She announced a new political era for Venezuela, released political prisoners, and cooperated with Trump's demands. The airspace reopening was her reward. American Airlines resuming flights wasn't just about commerce. It was a symbol of submission. But Venezuela is only one piece of a much larger strategy. Trump's national security strategy, released just weeks before the Maduro raid, explicitly calls for prioritizing the Western Hemisphere above all other regions. It introduces what the administration calls the Trump Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which promises to deny extra hemispheric powers like China and Russia the ability to position forces or other threatening capabilities, or to own or control strategically vital assets in our hemisphere. The strategy goes further. It states that the U.S. wants nations to see America as their partner of first choice and will, through various means, discourage their collaboration with others. Translation: align with us or face consequences. And those consequences are already being deployed across the region. Colombia's leftist president Gustavo Petro faced U.S. sanctions until he agreed to resume coca fumigation and extradite drug traffickers. Argentina's Javier Milei received a $20 billion bailout from Washington, contingent on future elections going the right way. Mexico faces 25% tariff threats unless it complies with Trump's immigration and Cuba policies. The economic pressure is just as devastating as the military operations. Venezuela's oil industry, which once produced 3.5 million barrels per day in the 1990s, had collapsed to just 800,000 barrels per day under Maduro due to mismanagement and sanctions. Now, with Maduro gone, U.S. oil companies like Chevron are being invited back in. Analysts project that within 2 years, production could reach 1.3 to 1.4 million barrels per day, with modest investment of $10 to $20 billion. But here's the catch. Trump has made clear that increased oil revenues will first go toward compensating American energy companies for assets seized by Hugo Chavez in 2007. ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips have $60 billion in outstanding claims against Venezuela. Only after those debts are paid will Venezuela see any benefit from its own resources. It's economic colonialism dressed up as investment. The Cuba embargo takes this even further. By threatening tariffs on any country supplying oil to the island, Trump is effectively weaponizing the global economy to strangle Cuba into submission. Cuba's energy grid is already collapsing with frequent blackouts. Without Venezuelan oil, and now facing pressure on Mexican supplies, the island could literally run out of fuel. The communist government in Havana faces an existential threat not seen since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia and China, the two powers Trump's strategy explicitly targets, have been left humiliated and exposed. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov condemned the Maduro operation but offered no concrete support. Russian military bloggers even expressed begrudging respect for how well the U.S. operation was executed. Moscow is too bogged down in Ukraine to project power in Latin America anymore. China's reaction has been even more muted. Chinese diplomats were meeting with Maduro just hours before the raid, completely unaware of what was coming. Chinese-supplied air defense systems, including JY-27A radars and HQ-9 surface-to-air missiles, failed to stop the American assault. Beijing's inability to protect its closest ally in the Western Hemisphere reveals the limits of its global reach. This is the new reality Trump is imposing. Latin America is America's sphere of influence, and no outside power will be tolerated. The days of leftist governments in the region cozying up to Beijing or Moscow are over. Align with Washington or face military intervention, crippling sanctions, and economic isolation. The implications are staggering. For decades after the Cold War, the U.S. largely stepped back from direct military interventions in Latin America. The disastrous wars in Iraq and Afghanistan made regime change operations politically toxic. But Trump has calculated that the American public will tolerate these operations if they're quick, successful, and framed as fighting drug cartels or restoring democracy. The Venezuela raid proved the concept works. No American casualties. Maduro in custody within hours. And a compliant government installed that does Washington's bidding. It's a template that can be replicated elsewhere. Cuba could be next. Trump has already declared the island an unusual and extraordinary threat to U.S. national security. With the oil embargo tightening and the regime weakening, a similar operation to remove Cuba's leadership is no longer unthinkable. Nicaragua's Daniel Ortega, another leftist leader with ties to Russia and China, could also find himself in American crosshairs. But what we're witnessing is nothing less than the reassertion of American empire in its own backyard. The Monroe Doctrine, dormant for decades, has been revived with 21st century military technology and economic weapons. Latin America is being forced to choose: submit to Washington's demands or face the consequences. And those consequences, as Nicolás Maduro learned on January 3rd, can come in the middle of the night with helicopters, bombs, and special forces. The reopening of Venezuelan airspace on January 30th wasn't just about flights. It was a declaration. The United States is back in charge of the Western Hemisphere. And this time, it's not asking for permission.